The following program has been produced under a grant from Rosenblatt's Cut Rate Drugs, Sterile Leeches, Our Specialty, with additional funding from Ernie's Storm Door and Family Counseling Service. Investigate our All Seasons Family Protection Plan. Nestled in the scenic Flint Hills of Kansas is the Institute for Pi Research, which is destined to change the teaching of mathematics in our public schools. We asked Dr. Samuel E. Dix to explain the nature and purpose of the Institute.
The Institute for Pi Research is a non-profit, non-partisan, non-sectarian educational research organization. The worldwide headquarters are in Emporia, Kansas, and we have over 100 charter members, and we are increasing daily. We are in some ways similar to the Institute for Creation Research, which is concerned with the teaching of special creation on an equal basis with the teaching of evolution. But we have a much more serious cause than that organization with which we are not affiliated. That is the teaching of pi as 3, as it is proclaimed in the Old Testament, rather than the more modernistic teaching of pi as 3.14159, etc. We think this problem is more insidious than the teaching of evolution in our public schools because pi is taught on the elementary school level when children are easily brainwashed. We want at least equal time given to the teaching of pi as 3, along with the more modernistic 3.14159. And similar to the Institute for Creation Research, we want to further legislation to ensure equal time for our teaching of pi with the more modernistic pi, just as they wish to have the teaching of special creation on an equal basis with the teaching of evolution.
Research librarian Barbara Robbins is the Institute archivist. Mrs. Robbins was asked to enlighten us on the earlier background of the pi controversy and the biblical passages pertaining to the value of pi.
We know that Archimedes is credited with developing the method for calculating pi. And we know that mathematicians through the many years since have been quarreling over the number of decimal points pi can be computed and the means for doing that. The height of excess has been reached in the last few years in the computer age, when computers have been programmed to calculate pi to over 500,000 places. But what about the one true archive, the document of documents, the Bible? In approximately 1000 BC, almost 800 years before Archimedes, King Solomon's temple was built. And the Old Testament tells us that pillars of bronze were cast, and their circumference was 12 cubits, not 12 and some left over. Outside the temple was a molten sea, or, as archaeologists believe, an immense bronze basin resting on the backs of 12 bronze oxen, which, as the Bible tells us, was round, was 10 cubits from brim to brim, or diameter, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Solomon's temple stood for almost 400 years. If the builders had used an erroneous figure for pi, would the temple have stood so long? The Chinese were using 3 for pi as early as 1200 BC, and they invented the decimal system. This is certainly scientific and historical evidence in support of teaching pi as 3. For the last 2,000 years, Christians in the Western world have been concerned about the pagan concept of pi as 3.1416 plus. Entire libraries have been burnt by the church fathers, condemning mathematical works as those of the devil. As late as 1897, a physician introduced a bill in the Indiana State Legislature entitled "A Bill Introducing a New Mathematical Truth," and offered it as a contribution to education. In Section 1 of the bill, Dr. Goodwin declares that the diameter employed as a linear unit according to the present rule in computing the circle's area is entirely wrong, and then proceeds to explain the correct way. The bill passed the House unanimously and would have almost certainly passed the Senate if a mathematics professor had not stepped in at the last minute and convinced the senators to vote it down. The Senate voted to table the bill indefinitely, where it has been ever since.
Now let us turn to the present. This is a research institute, and Dr. Robert F. Clark is the Director of Research. I asked Dr. Clark to summarize some of the results of the Institute's research activities.
The Greek letter pi is founded on 3 and not 3.1416. You notice that the three lines, which stand for 3, an even 3, if this outside line was transposed and moved, it evolved from this figure into this position, we have the letter pi. Therefore, pi itself, as every student knows, is composed of 3 and not 3.1416. Also, in our rummaging through ancient history and so forth, there were a few other items which I'd like to give you. One is that in early times, Anaxagoras in 428 BC first spoke out concerning the use of the wrong pi, and for this he was sentenced to die. The executioner picked the wrong plant, so instead of being poisoned by hemlock, he only got stoned. We found that Troy fell because they utilized the short pi, so their chariot wheels were smaller than those of the Greeks. This gave the Greeks, who used a long pi, the mechanical advantage of using larger wheels. After this, the Trojans had the slogan, "Beware of Greeks bearing pies." And this has been challenged. There are two North Poles. The magnetic North Pole in this position and the true North Pole. There are two North Poles because an early cartographer, N.S. Meridian, drew the circle here using the wrong pi. And forever after, this pi has been known as the Eskimo pi. Navigators use the long pi, which is the 3.1416, in their calculations of the great circle routes. And no doubt they could shorten this trip if they had recourse to the short pi. Aviators who have navigated in this manner swear by it. And they call it the true fly pi. This was first espoused by the late A.P. Doughty. I've also just recently found out a fact about the War for the Confederacy. This was lost by the South, I guess, as you know, perhaps in large measure because the round shot which the Confederates used was manufactured by an adherent to the short pi, and the Northern soldiers used their round shot, which was manufactured on the long pi. This gave them the advantage then of having more effective shot because it was larger. The squabble between long and short pies is not something that has just happened recently. It has gone all through history. Pythagoras, the early Greek mathematician and philosopher, about 500 years before Christ, said this. Pythagoras himself said several centuries ago, "I shall draw no line before its time." I have one other thing, a bit of evidence which was manufactured to show graphically how much you could save on using the short pi in opposition to the long pi. This wheel was manufactured using the long pi, and if we use the short pi for the diameter of this wheel, we would find that we could remove from it this much. Now this wheel could be shortened by this much and with a savings of this much material. Therefore, recourse to the short pi would be essential for our conservation of natural resources.
After we left the research director's office, our minicam crew walked along the halls and discovered others equally engrossed in research. Philosopher and logician Dr. Charles P. Bush.
Pi, of course, is the ratio between the circumference of a circle and its diameter. That is, the circumference of a circle equals pi times the diameter. Let's assume the diameter is 10. And if we use the traditional pi, that is as an infinite decimally expanded number, here's what happens. If pi is 3, then this circumference is going to be approximately 30, because it's 3.14, so it's going to be a little bit more than 3. But it's not 3.14, it's 3.141, so it's a little bit more. But it's not 3.141, it's 3.1415, so we're attempting to get closer to this other part, to terminate the circumference here. But it's not 3.1415, it's 3.14159, so again, it's a little longer, see, because we're multiplying 10 times this number here. However, traditionally, pi, the traditional theory, is an infinite number, which means that this gap in a circle will be infinitely small, because you can continually increase the size of the circumference but never terminate it, because it's going to be a gap. There'll be an infinitely small gap there. If you round it off, as some people are wont to do, into 3.1416, 9 being greater than 5, what will happen is that number, 3.1416, is greater than 3.14159. Hence, your circumference is going to overlap, and obviously it doesn't do that. Why? Well, because you'd have more than one circumference. You'd have a circumference and a part, but circles only have one circumference.
Biologist Dr. John Ransom.
I think the push by the Institute of Pi Research to change pi from the cumbersome 3.1416 to 3 probably makes about as much sense as some of those bills we have before 10 to 14 of our state legislatures in the United States at the present times. Now, those bills, if passed, would mandate the teaching of creationism on an equal time basis with evolution in our high school biology classes. And I also think that President Reagan would probably agree with us that pi should be 3, since it's in the Bible. He agrees with the creationists in their thoughts. And not only that, the other day I heard him say something like, the pi not being as big as we once thought it was.
Just as biologists have been under peer pressure not to support special creation, mathematicians have been under peer pressure not to recognize the biblical pi. Yet one brave mathematician, Dr. Marion Emerson, has overcome these satanic pressures to prove the equivalence of pi as 3.
And in constructing this wheel, we have used the true value of pi, which we want to be 3. And this is a very good representation, because here we have the diameter of the wheel, 2 radii make up the diameter. And now I'm going to use this string to measure the distance around. All right, there is 1 radius, 2 radius, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Exactly 6 radii. So if the diameter is equal to 2r, then the circumference here is 6r, which turns out to be 3 times the diameter. And this 3 is the use of the short pi. And we have a wheel here whose circumference is figured with the 3 as the approximation of pi. Now over here, I have another representation, and I am wanting to take an angle of 89 degrees, 44 minutes, and 45 seconds. And I will measure that angle here. I have made a computation of the circumference of this circle. And the ratio of the circumference of this circle to the diameter happens to be 3. Therefore, we have here a nice representation of the circle where pi is 3. Now, as you observe this, you'll say, well, it has flattened tops. Well, that is all right, because scientists tell us that if you look at the Earth is flat at the poles. So this shows that God created the Earth using 3 as pi. And furthermore, when they decided to measure the meter as the distance from the North Pole to the equator, they computed this distance using the long pi, 3.1416, and they came up and it's an error. So that the meter is no longer what it was supposed to be.
You are a brave man, Dr. Emerson. Now, if you can only get rid of those flat sides on your circle. The pi cause has also reached the attention of those people in our public schools who have not been completely brainwashed. Due to a strong family environment, this one student expressed a view counter to the secular humanist religion which dominates our schools in the name of science. Emporia High School student Jan Underwood.
So I thought maybe we should start an organization for the high school students, like, a branch off of the math club, a lower crust organization, if you will. I know that the other kids are interested. We talked about it in math, and one time I went into the physics room and the teacher said, oh, well, I'd like to see a circle where the circumference is 3 times the diameter. So I went to the board and drew one. And I don't think he believed me, but, you know, people are interested in it. There are other organizations like BYF and Youth for Christ. I think we should have a Youth for Pi. It would be a very pious organization.
Archivist Barbara Robbins visited with us also on the attention received by scientists throughout the country who remain true to the old values in spite of peer pressure.
The archives of our institute are growing rapidly, and we are receiving support from people throughout the country. For instance, a college professor from Colorado wrote a letter to the editor of the Emporia Gazette in which he states, "When I think of what the founders of the Institute have done, my mind is boggled. To relieve, if only in part, the sufferings of countless geometry students throughout the world is a humanitarian act. As I think back to those days long ago when I struggled to find the circumference of a circle in my geometry class, I am tugged by a small strain of melancholy at the realization how much easier life would have been if only I had known that pi was really 3. My teacher's perverse dogmatism in insisting that pi is 22/7 only illustrates the narrowness of the thinking of those times." He goes on to say, I intend to do all I can to help in this great cause. I am going to circulate my copy of the Gazette among my colleagues. I also intend to begin a campaign to see that the 21/7 concept is given equal time in the math classes in all the schools of Colorado. One of our most important pieces in our archives comes from 7 mathematics professors at Texas Tech University. They sent us a letter saying, "We, the undersigned mathematicians, having learned of the existence and work of the Emporia Institute for Pi Research, wish to lend our heartiest support to this most worthy project. It is vital to resist the demonic pressures of the age that hound otherwise sensible men and women into using the godless long pi. With dedication and hard work, we foresee the reestablishment of the scripturally sound qubit system. And we do intend to work hard and with much dedication."
What are the social and economic consequences of the present modernist pi? We ask this of Dr. Loren Pennington, an economic historian specializing in the history of the Studebaker Corporation.
Now, I'm a long-time student of the American automobile industry, and I've come to the conclusion that much of the automobile industry's trouble today is this inability to measure the circumference of a circle correctly. For example, here we have been getting these gallons of oil from OPEC. Now, a gallon of oil is a given volume of oil. But what has happened to us is that they have been giving it to us in barrels that they claim contain 42 gallons, but because they calculate pi incorrectly, the barrel actually only contains a little over 40 gallons. So every time we buy a barrel of oil from OPEC, we're being gypped almost 2 gallons. Besides that, you wonder why your tires wear out so fast? The reason they wear out so fast is they're not as big around as they claim they are, and they go around more times per mile. If we just calculate pi correctly, the American automobile industry would be in a lot better shape than it's in.
Dr. Phil Renard, physicist and Institute stargazer, discussed with us the question of pi in the sky.
When I was just a lad growing up here in central Kansas, I used to lay out in the wheat fields at night, look up at the stars, and see the twinkling going on, wondering, what is this twinkling? Does it mean something? Is there a message to it, or is it just something random? Well, at the time, I was too young to know. And when I got older, I thought then I understood that twinkling was merely a random event in the atmosphere. Well, now, the Pi Research Society has made me think more deeply about it, and I realized that there's a deeper significance to one particular twinkling in this particular constellation called Perseus, which I used to watch as that lad in the wheat fields. Perseus is an interesting constellation because of the shape of the arrangement of the stars. You can see there's one leg coming up here, another leg there, rather a horizontal band of stars over here. If you complete those by connecting the dots, as I used to do as a lad in Kansas, sure enough you get pi, the classical Greek symbol for pi. That's a tip-off that we should be paying attention to this constellation in a different way than we normally do. In particular, one star that doesn't just twinkle, but alternates in its light intensity is Algol. This star Algol is within the constellation Perseus. Algol is a very fascinating star because the light gets brighter, dimmer on a very regular pattern that takes 3 days. Now that's kind of a coincidence here. Perseus looks like a pi. This Algol fluctuates its light intensity every 3 days. Furthermore, the light intensity varies between a magnitude of 3.5 and 2.3. Now these magnitudes, I don't think the average man can understand what they mean. These were created by astronomers. It's not an evolved system of numbers. This is a creation of numbers that fit the brightness of stars. 3.5 and 2.3. The light intensity goes bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark every 3 days between 2.3 and 3.5. And you look at these numbers and there it is again. The 3 is present on the two ends, and in between there's a 5 and a 2. Here's a 3, a 5, a 2, and a 3. And if you subtract these numbers, if you subtract those numbers, 5, 2, yep, there's another 3. That equals 3. 3 threes, in fact. Not just 2, not just 1, but 3 threes from these magnitude numbers. Perseus, the constellation that looks like pi, has a star that tells us what pi is. 3 days, 3 threes in the magnitudes. What more can you say? It's very conclusive. This pi in the sky obviously tells us that pi equals 3.
Before we left the Institute for Pi Research, we asked one last question of the Institute Director, Dr. Dix. If you scientists are successful in this endeavor, what will be your next cause?
If we are successful, and I know we will be, in the teaching of pi as 3, at least on equal basis, with a more modernistic pi, our next goal will be replacing the metric system, which was furthered by secular humanists during the French Revolution, with the more traditional and biblical cubit.
Long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell us what's wrong and what's right. But when asked how about something to eat, they will answer with voices so sweet. You will eat by and by in that beautiful land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll eat pie in the sky when you die, that's a lie.